Behind this door lies the only place on a ship where a man could truly be alone. But in the golden age of sail, when 200 men were packed into a hull the size of a country farmhouse, breathing the same foul air, eating the same rotting biscuit, and sleeping shoulder to shoulder in hammocks strung 18 inches apart, being alone was not a luxury, it was a weapon. This wasn't just a bedroom. It was a courtroom. It was a war room. It was the one space on the entire vessel where decisions got made that meant the difference between a crew going home rich or not going home at all, and it was, more often than any captain's biography admits, a cage. Today we're stepping inside. We're going to walk through every corner of the great cabin, the furniture designed to survive 30-degree rolls, the tools that were the true brain of the ship, the psychological armor a captain was forced to wear the moment he closed that door, and the strange, violent moment in every battle when his entire private world was dismantled in seconds. I'm talking about the hidden life of the man in charge, the secrets, the solitude, and the sheer weight of command that only one room on the ship could contain. Welcome aboard. Let's open the door. If you were a common sailor in the Royal Navy during the 1700s, the great cabin at the ship's stern was a place you entered for one reason only: to receive orders, punishment, or, on very rare occasions, a commendation that was over before you had time to look around. It occupied the entire width of the stern, sometimes 30 to 40 feet across on a first-rate ship of the line. Large hinged glass windows ran across the rear, what sailors called the stern lights. On the gun deck below you, your shipmates slept in hammocks strung so tight a dropped coin would roll the length of the ship before finding floor. Up here, there was room to pace. There was room to think. But let's be honest about what luxury actually meant at sea. The great cabin on even a prestigious Royal Navy vessel was smaller than a modest London sitting room. The ceiling, or deckhead, as it was properly called, was rarely more than 6 feet high, which meant a tall captain was permanently hunched. The deck beneath the captain's fine turkey rug pitched and rolled with every swell. And those magnificent stern windows that let in so much light, they also let in every Atlantic gale with a gap in the caulking. Everything in the great cabin had to survive the sea. The desk, often called a campaign desk, was hinged and folding so it could be collapsed quickly. The captain's cot did not sit on legs. It hung from the deckhead on rope falls, and the genius of this design was simple. In a storm that threw a 2,000-ton ship of the line through 30-degree rolls, the suspended cot remained perfectly level through basic pendulum physics. The captain might be exhausted, but at least he slept horizontally. Canvas painted in a bold black and white checkerboard pattern covered the wooden deck. This was practical, not decorative. The checkered surface showed when the floor was clean, which mattered because the great cabin doubled as a dining room, a chart room, and sometimes a surgery on the bad days. The checkerboard told you, at a glance, if the men had cleaned up after themselves. There was almost always a fixed wooden partition separating the great cabin from a smaller sleeping space, and forward of that, the coach, a narrow transitional cabin where the first lieutenant or master might be summoned for urgent conversation without being invited all the way inside. The captain controlled access in layers, how far into his space he allowed. Someone was itself a signal of rank and trust. Here is the thing no portrait of a sea captain ever captures honestly. The luxury of the great cabin was not about the captain's personal comfort. It was a management strategy. The man who commanded 200 sailors through storms, enemy broadsides, scurvy, and months without land could not afford to look like his crew. The moment he was indistinguishable from the men in the forecastle, the hierarchy that made command possible began to erode. He needed to seem like a different order of being, not merely senior but separate by nature. The great cabin enforced that separation architecturally. The captain's distance from the crew was physically built into the ship. Every officer who entered and stood hat in hand while the captain remained seated was receiving a quiet lesson in the structure of authority. Every sailor who glimpsed through an open doorway, a desk covered in charts he couldn't read, and instruments he didn't understand, was being reminded that his captain operated in a different world. The illusion of luxury was, in fact, the machinery of command. If the great cabin was the brain of the ship, the captain's desk was the brain's frontal lobe. Everything that mattered passed through it. The logbook was the most important object in the cabin, more important than the weapons, more important than the charts. It was the only legal record of the voyage. Every day's position, every significant event, every disciplinary action, every death. It was all recorded in the log in the captain's own hand or his clerk's. If there was a court-martial, an inquiry, a dispute over prize money, a question about navigational error, the log was the evidence. A captain who kept a sloppy log was a captain who could not defend himself. The marine chronometer, a development that only became reliable by the mid-18th century, was kept in the cabin and checked religiously every morning against the noon sun sight. These instruments, sometimes worth more than a lieutenant's annual salary, were the only way to know your longitude with accuracy. Lose the chronometer, and you were navigating by dead reckoning and prayer, beneath the logbooks and charts. Most captains kept their private correspondence, letters from the Admiralty, sealed orders not to be opened until a certain latitude, personal letters from home that might be months old before they were read. The desk was also, in this sense, the most emotionally charged object on the ship. Almost every great cabin carried weapons, and not primarily for enemy action. A ship's captain faced threats from two directions: the enemy beyond the hull and his own crew within it. Mutiny was not a common event, but it was an ever-present possibility on any vessel where 200 men were being pushed past their endurance by weather, rations, disease, or the temperament of their officers. The rack of loaded pistols on the cabin wall was insurance against that possibility. Not because a captain could shoot his way out of a full mutiny. He couldn't, but because access to arms in the first seconds of a crisis could mean the difference between suppression and catastrophe. More practically, the cabin also served as the ship's safe. The captain held the keys to the spirit room, the powder magazine, and often the prize money chest. Those keys were almost always on his person or on his desk. The weapons in the cabin were in part protection for those keys. Running a ship was, by design, one of the loneliest jobs in the world. But building a community here at Void Bilge is anything but. If this voyage into the hidden history of the sea is the kind of thing that keeps you up past midnight clicking one more video, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Every new episode is another door we're opening together, and I genuinely want you on this crew. And while you're at it, comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's get back to the one thing every captain feared more than enemy broadsides, more than a lee shore in a gale, and far more than the admiral's inspection: the silence of his own cabin. The silence that came with being the only person on the ship who could not afford to admit he was afraid. Here is the rule that every Royal Navy captain understood, and none of them were explicitly taught: you cannot be a friend to the men you command. This was not cruelty, it was engineering. A captain who was on easy terms with his crew, who drank with them, who laughed with them as equals, who let them see his doubts, was a captain who had made it difficult for himself to make the decisions that command required. Because command required things like this: sending men aloft in a storm to save the ship, knowing some of them would fall, ordering a flogging because discipline was breaking down, deciding when the water ran short which men got more and which men got less. A man you have joked with over rum is much harder to send to his death than a man you have maintained a correct, formal, professional distance from. The loneliness of command was not a side effect. It was a prerequisite. The result was a life of extraordinary isolation in an extraordinarily crowded environment. The captain was surrounded by hundreds of men at every moment, and he ate alone, slept alone, made decisions alone, and bore the outcome of those decisions alone. He could not share his fears with his officers without undermining confidence in him. He could not share them with the crew without losing authority entirely. The great cabin was the only place he could let his face do whatever it needed to do. There was a tradition, maintained across navies and centuries, of the captain inviting his officers to dine with him. It sounds sociable. It was in practice one of the most carefully managed performances on the ship. The food at the captain's table was better. He supplied it from his own stores, which he purchased out of his own pay. The wine was his private stock, the china and silver were his, but the atmosphere was governed by rules so rigid they were barely unspoken. Conversation was formal, confined to professional matters or safe generalities. No officer criticized another at the captain's table. No one raised a complaint. No one relaxed. The invitation to dine was itself a signal of favor, of trust, sometimes of a coming reprimand delivered so indirectly the recipient didn't understand it until later. The captain's table was not a place of relaxation. It was a place of performance, and the captain was always the one performing hardest. Compare this with what we learned studying Black Sam Bellamy's pirate articles. The democracy, the shared meals, the vote on every major decision. The world of the Royal Navy captain and the world of the Golden Age pirate were inverted mirrors of each other, and men chose piracy in part because the isolation of naval command was not reserved for captains. The entire system was built on separation, silence, and fear. The pirates just built the opposite. The most revealing thing about the great cabin is what happened to it the moment battle was imminent. On the drumbeat to quarters, when the call came to clear the ship for action, the great cabin ceased to exist. The carpenter's crew moved through it like a practiced demolition team. The furniture went below or forward. The captain's personal chest was struck down into the hold. The painted canvas deck covering was rolled up and removed, and then the removable wooden partition walls, built exactly for this purpose, were knocked apart, lifted out, and stacked. In minutes, the most private space on the ship was gone. In its place, an open extension of the gun deck, sometimes housing 2 or more stern chase guns that could fire directly aft through those magnificent windows that had let in the afternoon light and the view of the horizon. The captain's private world was, literally and deliberately, designed to disappear. The Navy did not allow its captains anything that would slow down the guns. Everything beautiful was temporary. Everything functional was permanent. The stern windows that framed the Atlantic were beautiful, but they were also gun ports. The cabin floor that held the turkey rug was beautiful, but it was also a gun platform. During the battle itself, the captain was not in his cabin. He was on the quarterdeck, exposed, visible to every man on the ship, showing exactly the calm he may or may not have felt. Below him, where his desk had been, and his cot had hung, and his logbook had recorded the quiet business of passage, the guns were firing, and when the battle was over and the smoke cleared, the carpenter's crew came back. They rebuilt the cabin around him. It happened every time, and every time it was a reminder. The captain was not the ship's most important person. The guns were. The next time you see a tall ship, in a museum, in a harbour, in a painting, don't just look at the sails. Don't just count the cannons. Look at those windows at the stern. Look at that row of glass and light at the back of the hull. Behind them lived a man who had everything a common sailor could dream of. Space, light, food, privacy, authority, and nothing that made any of it bearable. No friendship he could trust. No conversation he could have freely. No moment of weakness he could afford. He commanded the most powerful technology of his age. He was obeyed without question by hundreds of men, and he was, in a very real sense, as trapped as the ship itself, held in place by duty, by law, by the weight of everyone who depended on him to be exactly what the role required. The captain's cabin was many things, but it was never truly his own.